Hi everyone, I just wanted to do a quick overview video for you, talking about the readings that are available for this week and some of the differences between them. It's fine if you've gone ahead and chosen a reading and gotten started. You don't have to wait on overviews like this to pick something to read. But for those of you who haven't chosen something, and I'll give you a little bit of information about the readings available, and even if you've already chosen one, you might learn something about the ones you didn't choose. So this week you're meant to choose one reading. The reading load will accelerate over time, but at the moment it's just one reading from this big long list. Next week I'll do a little bit of lecture on managing the reading load, on strategies for handling these kinds of texts, because from next week you'll be reading two things, and you'll read two things a week for the next several weeks, and then it'll go up to 3 things a week, but we're not going to get any higher than that. The idea, though, is to build your reading skill over the term to get you used to handling these kinds of materials. So once you've had a little bit of practice trying one of these texts this week, next week I'll give you some more tips about how to handle reading this kind of material when it is unfamiliar to you. So for this week, we've got a choice, and I'll just go through these one by one. There's Stuart Hall, which gives an extremely good overview of some basic theoretical terms that we're going to run into again in the course. He defines terms like discourse, ideology, essentialism, Orientalism, and he also talks about historical events that we're going to be referring back to quite a lot. It's not the shortest reading, but it is deliberately written to try to explain things to people who are not familiar with them, so it may be one of the more accessible readings. If you don't read the Hall, but you're still interested in learning the background the Hall provides, you might want to consider listening to the podcast on his work. There's Bruno Latour, which is also fairly accessible. It starts off talking about newspapers and things in the everyday world, and it provides an introduction to a field called science and technology studies that we're going to run into again when we look at debates over the sciences. The shortest reading for the week is Jean and John Komaroff's. They're discussing theoretical impacts of global economic restructuring. So they're specifically looking at the way in which the reorganization of the global economy is changing the relation between the global north and the global south, and what implications this might have for where we're generating good theory, insightful theory that helps us understand what's going on. It's quite short, so on that level it's one of the easier texts to read, but because it's short, it's very compressed. It can be a little bit hard to unpack. But if you are familiar with discussions around global economy, you may find it a very accessible text. We have Michel Foucault writing a direct response to Kant's What is Enlightenment? What is Enlightenment is one of the texts that I spend a whole lecture on. It's one of our common lectures. And the Foucault is a good piece because it is replying directly to that common text. We're looking at Jürgen Habermas as well. The Habermas is a somewhat difficult text, but it is a response to Foucault and to forms of theory like Foucault, and it also introduces the topic of neoconservatism, which is something that we'll return to later in the term. Most of the things that we're looking at this week are either representatives of the Enlightenment or people who are grappling with the idea of Enlightenment, but who sort of want to inherit it. Isaiah Berlin gives us an analysis of movements that are critical of the Enlightenment, that are opposed to it, and analyzes their relationship to later political movements. He's particularly concerned with what are the theoretical strands that wind up assisting or promoting or paving the way for movements such as fascism. Leo Strauss is a figure where we'll run into some of his students and some of his followers later in the term. He's often regarded as one of the founding fathers of what becomes neoconservatism. There are people who contest how valid that is. His piece is looking at successive waves of modernity. Modernity for him goes through several stages, and he analyzes that in terms of the political philosophy characteristic of those stages. And he associates each stage with political heirs in liberal democracy, communism, and fascism. Agnes Heller is one of the more difficult texts to read this week. It's deep in the trenches of some complicated philosophical debates, but it's trying to examine tensions within the conception and the practice of modernity, looking for some kind of critical impulse within modernity that points the way beyond totalitarianism. And McClintock's also a more difficult text, quite an interesting one, and it's analyzing the sexual and racial imaginary that's implicated in the violence of imperialism. So once you've chosen a reading, you want to make sure that you work through the text and that you also look at the podcasts, and you may want to look at least at the shared podcasts fairly early in your reading process because they'll provide some common background. So the shared podcasts are required viewing. They're part of what you need to do to prepare for class discussion. They serve as a common text that makes sure that we have a common reference point when we're talking, because we're all going to be reading different things. There are handouts associated with these podcasts. The handouts are just for the purpose of letting you back up and see longer versions of the text than I wanted to put up on screen when I was doing the podcasts themselves. They're available just above where the readings are available in the Week 2 content folder. Then there are a bunch of supplemental podcasts. These are optional. You do not have to watch them, but you'll probably find them useful, particularly if you're new to this kind of material, or if you've picked a text where you're a little bit unsure whether you've quite got it, whether you've quite understood it. The supplemental podcasts are about individual texts, whereas the shared podcasts are usually going to be about general themes and lots of texts, although we do have a shared podcast on Kant this week. The supplemental podcasts are designed to help you understand the argument and the structure of the text. Some of these texts can be really hard to read. One thing I can say that may reassure you is that the texts this week are among the hardest we're going to look at. It's why you only have one reading this week. These are difficult going. They're grappling with issues that are very abstract. Things get better as we go forward from here, so if that helps. But the podcasts are designed to help you make sense of these quite difficult texts, where they may be referring to a lot of people that you've not heard of, or if you've heard of them you may not know exactly what is meant by the reference. The language is often quite abstract and often quite convoluted and difficult to follow. So the podcast will break these down and help you understand how the argument is structured and what the author is trying to say. They also provide a bit of additional context about where the text fits into broader debates about social and political theory. You probably want to at least look at the supplemental podcast on the reading that you've chosen, but if you're curious, the supplemental podcasts are a really good way of getting some information about other texts that you didn't read. It's sort of an easy way to get some additional background. It's faster for most people than reading the texts themselves would be. So feel free to watch as many of them as you'd like, but if you are pressed for time, it's the shared podcasts that you want to look at. The supplementals are optional.